The first snow of December had come early that year, dusting the rooftops of Maple Hollow, a small town in northern Minnesota where winters felt longer than anywhere else on Earth. The snow turned the world soft and soundless, as if someone had draped a white quilt over every noise that might disturb the quiet. Arthur Blake sat at his kitchen table that morning, watching the flakes gather on the windowsill. The old farmhouse creaked faintly with every gust of wind. His coffee had long gone cold, but he didn't bother reheating it. At 70, Arthur had learned that some things simply lose their warmth with time. Coffee, memories, even people. The knock came softly at first, then more firmly. He knew who it was before he even stood up. "Come in," he called. The door opened, letting in a draft of cold air and the scent of pine. Evan, his only son, stepped in with a practiced smile. He brushed snow from his coat, leaving melting drops on the floorboards. "Dad," he said cheerfully, "you really need to fix the heating in here. It's freezing." Arthur smiled faintly. "It works fine if you let it run long enough." Evan laughed, setting his leather gloves on the counter. He looked every bit the modern professional. Tailored coat, polished shoes, that expensive watch gleaming under the kitchen light. Arthur felt an old ache in his chest, a mix of pride and something sharper, something that hurt to name. "I brought you something," Evan said, pulling a brown paper bag from under his arm. "Your favorite, cranberry muffins from that bakery in Duluth." Arthur's heart softened a little. "You remembered." Of course. Evan poured himself coffee without asking, the way people do in homes they once belonged to. "So," he began, sitting down across from his father, "I've been thinking a lot about you lately." Arthur chuckled quietly. "That sounds serious." "It is," Evan said, his tone switching from casual to professional, the way Arthur had heard him speak to clients over the phone. "You're living out here all alone, Dad. The winters are rough. You shouldn't have to worry about bills, taxes, maintenance, any of it. You've done enough." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "I'm doing fine, son." Evan leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Listen, I know you think that, but times have changed. Everything's online now. Auto payments, taxes, accounts. It's confusing for someone who didn't grow up with it." He smiled. That same easy, polished smile he'd inherited from his mother. "Let me take care of it for you. I can handle your banking, your bills, all of it. Just until you're ready." Arthur studied his son's face carefully. The words were kind. The tone was calm, but something in it, something rehearsed, made the old man's chest tighten. "You'd need access to my accounts. Then," Arthur said slowly. "Of course," Evan replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "It'll just make things simpler. I'll keep everything transparent. You can see every transaction. It's for your peace of mind." Arthur nodded, but his fingers tightened around his mug. "For your peace of mind." That was the phrase people used when they were really talking about control. "Let me think about it," Arthur said finally. Evan looked faintly disappointed, like a salesman who'd come close to closing a deal. "Sure," he said easily, but the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just don't wait too long. Things can get complicated fast." When he left an hour later, the house felt colder than before. Arthur stood at the window watching his son's black SUV roll down the gravel drive until it vanished into the woods. For a long time, he just stood there, the silence of the house pressing in around him. The ticking of the clock was the only sound. That night, Arthur sat by the fire, staring at the flames. His late wife, Margaret, used to sit beside him on winter nights like this, her knitting basket by her feet, her laughter filling the room. She'd been gone for 9 years now, and the house had grown quieter with each season. He remembered how Evan used to sit by the hearth as a boy, building small wooden castles out of kindling sticks. He'd been curious, clever, sensitive, always asking questions about the stars, the moon, the way fire worked. Arthur had tried to give him everything he could. Private school, college in the city, a start in life he himself had never known. But somewhere along the way, that bright-eyed boy had turned into a man who measured worth in numbers and success in control. Arthur poured himself another cup of tea. He told himself he was imagining things, that Evan was just being practical. But as the fire crackled and the wind howled through the cracks in the old window panes, something in his gut whispered that the visit had not been about help. It had been about possession. The next morning, Arthur went about his chores as usual. He fed the chickens, shoveled snow from the porch, and filled the wood bin. Life in the countryside moved in quiet routines. He liked it that way. Around noon, he opened the mail. One envelope caught his eye. A sleek, cream-colored letterhead from Hastings Financial, Evans' firm in Minneapolis. Inside was a printed authorization form, neatly typed, waiting for his signature. Power of attorney for financial management. Arthur stared at the line where his name should go, the pen mark from Evans' note at the bottom. "Just sign and I'll take care of everything. E." Made his stomach turn. He folded the paper slowly and slipped it into the drawer under the phone. Then he went outside, into the biting wind, and stood looking across the snow-covered field. The world was silent, but inside him, something restless stirred. That evening, his neighbor Tom Calder, a retired sheriff, stopped by to drop off some homemade cider. "You've been quiet lately," Tom said, stamping the snow off his boots. "Everything all right?" Arthur hesitated. "My boy wants to help with my finances. Says it's for my peace of mind." Tom gave a low whistle. "That kind of help usually costs more than it saves." Arthur smiled faintly. "You think so too? I've seen too many folks in town sign away their homes to helpful family," Tom said, lowering his voice. "You're a smart man, Arthur. Trust, but verify." Arthur nodded. The advice settled in his mind like a stone sinking into water. That night, when the snow stopped and the stars returned, Arthur opened the drawer again and stared at the unsigned paper. He thought of Evan's confident tone, his expensive watch, his eyes that never quite met his own. He closed the drawer without touching it. For the first time in years, he locked it. The first snow of December had come early that year, dusting the rooftops of Maple Hollow, a small town in northern Minnesota where winters felt longer than anywhere else on Earth. The snow turned the world soft and soundless, as if someone had draped a white quilt over every noise that might disturb the quiet. Arthur Blake sat at his kitchen table that morning, watching the flakes gather on the windowsill. The old farmhouse creaked faintly with every gust of wind. His coffee had long gone cold, but he didn't bother reheating it. At 70, Arthur had learned that some things simply lose their warmth with time. Coffee, memories, even people. The knock came softly at first, then more firmly. He knew who it was before he even stood up. "Come in," he called. The door opened, letting in a draft of cold air and the scent of pine. Evan, his only son, stepped in with a practiced smile. He brushed snow from his coat, leaving melting drops on the floorboards. "Dad," he said cheerfully, "you really need to fix the heating in here. It's freezing." Arthur smiled faintly. "It works fine if you let it run long enough." Evan laughed, setting his leather gloves on the counter. He looked every bit the modern professional. Tailored coat, polished shoes, that expensive watch gleaming under the kitchen light. Arthur felt an old ache in his chest, a mix of pride and something sharper, something that hurt to name. "I brought you something," Evan said, pulling a brown paper bag from under his arm. "Your favorite. Cranberry muffins from that bakery in Duluth." Arthur's heart softened a little. "You remembered." 2 weeks passed before Arthur heard from Evan again. In that time, the snow deepened, the sky darkened, and the world seemed to shrink to the size of his small kitchen and the steady rhythm of his routines. Every morning, he walked to the edge of his property, a mile of frozen fields, and checked the mailbox. The road beyond it stretched empty, bordered by silent birch trees. Sometimes, he half expected to see Margaret's figure walking up the lane the way she used to when they were younger, her scarf blowing like a red flag against the white. But there was only wind. When the phone finally rang one afternoon, he startled so badly he spilled tea on the counter. "Dad?" Evan's voice was cheerful, warm, practiced. "Hey, just checking in. Did you get the forms I sent?" Arthur wiped his hands with a rag. "I did. And? I've been thinking about them." Evan paused, then laughed lightly. "You don't need to think about it, Dad. It's just paperwork. Makes things easier for both of us." Arthur could hear traffic behind him, a car horn, maybe an office lobby echo. His son was multitasking, talking to his father while probably reading an email or checking his phone. He'd always been good at that, half present. "I appreciate the offer," Arthur said carefully, "but I'm not ready to sign over my accounts." "Not yet." Silence. Then a sigh. "Dad," Evan said softly, "I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm trying to protect you. You're living out there like it's 1980. Do you even have two-factor authentication on your bank app?" Arthur almost smiled. "I don't even know what that is." "Exactly." Evan's tone brightened again, but there was an edge under it. "You could get scammed, hacked, or worse. I'm just trying to make sure you're safe. You raised me to be responsible. Let me do that." Arthur wanted to tell him that responsibility didn't mean control, but something in him, the father part, the old softness that comes from decades of loving someone who carries your blood, held him back. "I'll think about it," he repeated. Evan didn't push further, but Arthur could tell he was disappointed. That night, as he watched the last of the fire burn down to embers, he thought about how strange it was. The way love could turn into strategy. A few days later, the first sign of trouble came quietly. Arthur had gone into town to buy feed and a few groceries. When he tried to use his debit card at the store, it declined. He frowned. There was more than enough in his account. He tried again. Declined. The cashier, a kind woman named Nancy, gave him an apologetic look. "Happens all the time with these banks. You might want to call them." Back home he did. The bank representative, after a few minutes of checking, said politely, "Mr. Blake, your account access was updated last week. Your son, Evan Blake, is listed as a joint account holder now. He must have requested the change." Arthur's pulse slowed. "That can't be. I didn't authorize that." "Well, sir," she said, "we have an electronic form signed under your name. It looks valid." He hung up before she finished explaining. For a long time he sat there, the phone still in his hand. Outside, the snow was falling again, quiet as ash. When Evan arrived that weekend, he brought flowers and groceries, as if nothing had happened. "Thought I'd surprise you," he said with a grin. "You running low on firewood?" Arthur watched him unload the bags, his movements easy, confident. He waited until they were sitting by the fire before speaking. "I called the bank," he said quietly. Evan didn't look surprised. "Ah, yeah, about that. I took care of the transfer." "It's just joint access, Dad. Nothing changes for you." "You forged my signature." "Electronic authorization," Evan corrected smoothly. "I used your old email. You never check it anyway." "I figured it'd be faster." Arthur's jaw tightened. "That wasn't your choice to make." Evan sighed and set his cup down. "Dad, you're making this harder than it needs to be. I'm not stealing from you. I'm helping. You've worked your whole life. Let me make sure that work doesn't get wasted because you clicked the wrong thing online." Arthur said nothing. He looked at his son's face. The same high cheekbones Margaret used to kiss. The same dimple that once appeared when he laughed as a child. But now it all seemed rehearsed, mechanical. "Do you remember," Arthur said slowly, "when you were 12 and you wanted that mountain bike?" Evan frowned slightly. "What does that have to do with anything? I told you to earn half of it mowing lawns. You did, every dollar. You were so proud that day. You said, 'Now I know what things cost.'" Arthur's eyes softened. "I think about that sometimes. How proud I was." Evan looked away. "That's ancient history." "Maybe," Arthur said, "but it's when I first saw who you were. I miss that boy." There was a silence that filled the room like heavy snow. Finally, Evan stood. "I didn't come here to argue," he said. "I came to make sure you're taken care of. If you can't see that, then maybe you don't trust me." Arthur met his gaze. "Right now, I don't know if I do." Evan's expression changed. Not anger, not sadness, but something colder. "That's disappointing," he said. "Really?" He left soon after, not even finishing his coffee. Arthur watched his car disappear down the road again, a long black streak in the snow. Over the next few weeks, little changes began to show. Bills started arriving late. Some of his auto payments stopped working. A notice from the bank said that several transactions were consolidated under financial management services. Arthur didn't understand half the terms. When he called Evan, his son's tone was patient but sharp, like a man explaining something obvious to a child. "Dad, I moved your savings into a joint portfolio. You'll get better returns this way." "I didn't ask for that. I'm trying to make sure you don't lose what you've got. Markets are volatile right now." Arthur swallowed his frustration. "I want my accounts separate again." "That's not really efficient," Evan said. "You wouldn't understand the logistics." "Try me," Arthur said, his voice firmer now. There was a pause. Then Evan sighed dramatically. "You're being paranoid. Look, I've got a meeting. We'll talk later." The line went dead. That night, Arthur sat on the porch, wrapped in an old blanket, listening to the far-off howl of wolves. The moon was bright, cutting the snow into sharp silver shapes. He felt old, older than he ever had. He thought about calling Tom, but pride held him back. He didn't want to sound like one of those old men who'd lost control of their lives. He wanted to believe his son would stop, that somewhere inside that ambitious, charming man was still the boy who used to build wooden castles by the fire. But deep down, he knew better. He stood and went inside, lit a lamp, and pulled out a notebook. The pages were yellowed and rough. He began to write. Dates, details, phone calls, amounts. Every transaction he could recall. Every word Evan had said. If Evan wanted to play the game of control, Arthur would play it too. Quietly, patiently. The way the cold waits for the thaw. Winter loosened its grip on Maple Hollow slowly, like an old hand unclenching. By early March, the snow had begun to melt in long silver streams that trickled down the gravel driveway. The air smelled faintly of thawing earth and pine sap. Arthur Blake sat by the window, a cup of coffee steaming on the sill, his notebook open on his lap. The pages were filled now. Dates, figures, conversations, each one written in his slow, neat hand. The log of a man who had learned, too late, that love could be weaponized. He had spent weeks tracing every change Evan had made. Joint accounts, automated transfers, investment consolidations. The language was dense, meant to confuse, but he was patient. He had spent his life as a school teacher, and patience, like dignity, was a skill honed over time. He knew enough now to see the pattern. Evan hadn't stolen from him, not outright, but he had shifted control. His son now decided when the bills were paid, how much was withdrawn, even which accounts were frozen for optimization. It was a subtle theft, one of autonomy, not property, and in some ways, that was worse. That morning, Arthur closed the notebook and stood up slowly. The house groaned around him like an old friend waking from sleep. Margaret's framed photo sat on the mantel, her eyes bright, her smile soft. He touched the glass with his fingertips. "You always said to trust my gut," he murmured. "Well, I think I'm finally listening." The meeting. The next day, Arthur drove into town. The first time he'd left his land in over a month. The roads were slick with slush, the trees dripping with thaw. He stopped at the small law office on Main Street, the same one that handled farm disputes and wills. The brass sign on the door read, "Tom Calder and Associates." Tom looked up from his desk when Arthur entered, his eyebrows rising. "Arthur Blake, as I live and breathe." "Thought you'd gone into hibernation." Arthur smiled faintly. "Not quite. I need a little advice, Tom." Tom poured coffee for them both. "This about that boy of yours?" Arthur nodded once. "He's been managing my finances. Without my full consent." Tom leaned back, his face growing serious. "How bad?" Arthur slid the notebook across the desk. Tom flipped through it, whistling low. "You kept good records." "Damn good. Looks like he's been moving things under your name to accounts you don't control. Probably thinks you won't notice." Arthur folded his hands. "I want it stopped." "Legally, quietly." Tom nodded. "We can do that. I'll need your IDs, recent statements, and we'll file a reversal for unauthorized access. Might take a few weeks. You'll get your accounts back, and he'll get notified." Arthur's voice was calm. "That's fine. I just want my life back." Tom studied him. "You sure you don't want to confront him first?" Arthur's eyes drifted to the window. Outside, The snowmelt glistened on the street like broken glass. "No," he said softly. "That's what he wants. For me to argue, to react. But I've learned something in 70 years. Tom, sometimes silence is the sharpest blade you can use." The sun returns. It was another week before Evan called again. "Dad," he said briskly, "I just got some weird notices from the bank. Did you mess with the accounts?" Arthur was sitting by the fire, the phone pressed to his ear. "I did," he said. "They're back in my name now." "Why would you do that?" Evan's voice cracked slightly. Part disbelief, part annoyance. "I had everything streamlined." "I didn't ask for streamlined," Arthur said. "I asked for independence." "Dad, you're making a mistake. You don't understand how this works." "I understand enough." Arthur's tone was firm but quiet. "You used my name, my accounts, my trust. You told yourself it was help. But it wasn't. It was control." There was a long pause on the line. Then Evan laughed, short and bitter. "You're overreacting. You're too old to handle this kind of stuff." Arthur smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I'm not too old to know when someone's lying." For a moment all he could hear was breathing. Then Evan's voice came, colder now. "Fine. If that's how you want it, good luck. Don't call me when something goes wrong," Arthur said quietly. "I won't." He hung up. For a long while he sat there listening to the wind push against the windows. The silence that followed wasn't lonely. It was clean, like the air after a storm. A quiet rebuilding spring came early that year. By April the fields were green again, dotted with wildflowers. The creek at the edge of Arthur's land was alive with water gurgling under the bridge. He repaired the fence, painted the porch, and replanted Margaret's rose bushes, their thorns soft and red under his fingers. Sometimes, in the evenings, he'd sit outside with a glass of cider and listen to the frogs calling in the marsh. He thought often of Evan, not with anger, but with a kind of resigned sorrow. He still sent his son birthday cards, simple ones, no return address. Sometimes they came back unopened, but Arthur had stopped expecting replies. What surprised him most wasn't the pain of losing his son. It was the quiet joy of rediscovering his own company. He cooked for himself again, read books, fixed the leaky faucet in the kitchen instead of calling someone. Every small act of self-reliance became a thread, stitching his life back together. One evening Tom stopped by with his wife to drop off some pie. "Heard you got everything settled," Tom said, patting the porch rail. Arthur smiled. "Paperwork's clean." "I'm officially poor again," Tom laughed. "You've got land, a roof, and peace. That's rich enough." Arthur nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "It is." The latter summer passed, golden and slow. On a warm August afternoon, a letter arrived. The envelope was postmarked from Chicago. Arthur recognized the handwriting before he even opened it. "Dad, I don't expect you to forgive me. I told myself I was helping, but the truth is, I didn't trust you to manage without me. Maybe that says more about me than you. I've been thinking a lot lately. About Mom, about the farm, about how simple things used to feel. I hope you're okay. I hope the roses are blooming." Evan Arthur read it twice, then set it down beside Margaret's picture. He didn't reply. Not yet, but for the first time in months, he didn't feel anger when he thought of his son. He felt something smaller, gentler, pity perhaps, or the faint ache of love that never quite dies, no matter how much you try to bury it. Autumn. Again, by October, the air had turned crisp again. The leaves burned gold on the hills, and the mornings came cloaked in mist. Arthur's world had grown small but full. The chickens, the garden, the books on his shelf. Sometimes neighbors stopped by, bringing pies or needing help with their fences. They called him Mr. Blake, but the kids had started calling him Gramps, and he found that it didn't sting. He'd become, without trying, a kind of quiet guardian of the valley. The old man who always waved when you passed his lane, who fixed things that broke, who kept his gate open for anyone who needed warmth and coffee. And in that simplicity, he found peace. The final visit was late November when a car pulled up in his driveway again. A familiar black SUV. Arthur stood on the porch, hands in his pockets watching as Evan stepped out, coatless despite the chill. They hadn't seen each other in nearly a year. Evan looked older, thinner, tired around the eyes. He stood at the foot of the steps, uncertain. "I was nearby," he said quietly. "Thought I'd stop in." Arthur nodded once. "Come in then. It's cold." Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and bread. Evan looked around, his eyes lingering on the walls, the photos, the steady fire. "It hasn't changed much," he said. "It didn't need to," Arthur replied. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Evan spoke. "I didn't come for money, Dad." "I know," Arthur said. "I just—" He hesitated, staring into the flames. "I thought I was doing the right thing. Mom always said you didn't take help easily." Arthur's gaze softened. "She also said that love isn't control." Evan nodded slowly. His voice was quiet when he spoke again. "I lost a lot, you know. The firm went under. The markets crashed. Maybe I deserved it." Arthur sipped his tea. "Maybe. But life has a way of teaching what pride won't." Evan smiled faintly, a small, uncertain curve of his mouth. "I miss Mom." "So do I," Arthur said. The clock ticked softly between them. Outside, snow began to fall again, the first flakes of the coming winter. After a while, Arthur stood and fetched a second cup of tea. He set it in front of his son. "You're still my boy, Evan," he said quietly. "That doesn't change. But I need you to understand something." Evan looked up. "I forgive you," Arthur said. "But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. Trust has to be earned back, slowly, like spring after a long winter." Evan nodded, eyes wet. "I understand." Arthur smiled, small but real. "Then drink your tea. You look like you need the warmth." The quiet house, they didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was healing, the kind of silence that lets grief breathe and time mend what words can't. When Evan left the next morning, he hugged his father for the first time in years. It was brief, awkward, but it was a start. After he drove away, Arthur stood on the porch, the winter sun glinting off the frosted fields. He felt tired but not lonely. The quiet that once pressed on him now felt different, like peace, not emptiness. He turned back toward the house, the smell of wood and warmth greeting him like an embrace. On the mantel, Margaret's picture caught a beam of sunlight. Her smile seemed to say, "You did it," Arthur whispered. "I'm all right, Maggie. I really am." Then he sat down by the fire, opened his notebook to a fresh page, and began to write again. Not a record this time, but a story. His story. The story of a man who lost everything he thought he needed and found everything he truly did. Epilogue. 1 year later. Spring came again to Maple Hollow. Arthur's roses bloomed bright as blood against the wooden fence. He'd rebuilt the old barn, hosted neighborhood kids for weekend picnics, and learned, at last, to send an email without help. He still wrote to Evan sometimes. Short notes, simple lines. "The apples are ripe this year. The creek's running clear again. Hope you're well." Sometimes Evan wrote back. Sometimes he didn't. But the silence between them was no longer sharp. It was the quiet space love sometimes needs to grow back. And every evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Arthur sat on his porch, mug in hand, listening to the wind move through the trees. The same wind that once carried loneliness now carried peace, because the house wasn't empty anymore. It was full of memory, of forgiveness, of life. And for the first time in a long, long while, Arthur Blake was home.